Hi everyone, welcome to American Church History class. We have been discussing on the subject of how the church in America has begun and developed, and this will be week number 7. And last week we have just begun our discussion on the very beginning, the colonial era, the beginning of its history, the church, how it began. So let's quickly go over the review on the early beginning. Chapter 1, and as we see from Europe, there are development of Columbus from Spain coming to America, landed on East India islands, and then they thought it was India, but actually it was America. And not only the Spain and Portugal, also England was the big power. They had their trade with India and begin to colonize the land of India, and they began something called the United Kingdom, which is even they said the United Kingdom, the sun does not fall. I mean, the sun is always on around the globe in their kingdom. It was that big. And then on the religious side, that's the political side. The religious side, we had the Catholic and the Middle Age. Then at the end of Middle Age, there is this Reformation movement in Europe, begun by Martin Luther, and then Zwingli in Switzerland, and then Calvin. All these people, Calvin France, then later moved to the city of Zurich, I believe, and then this began like in early 16th century. So with this development, there is a new, so-called Protestant movement that's separated from the Catholic Church, and they began their own sort of denomination, or the new kind of different religion than Catholic. So after the Reformation, the post-Reformation, there are quite various dynamic movement within the Christian circle. And then something called Pietism. This is developed in 17th century Germany. So, in German, after Martin Luther, there is a Lutheran Church, which is more of a state church. I've told you about the state church. At the time of this development that we see, 16th, 17th, until 17th century, there is something called the national church. In Germany, it's Lutheran Church becomes its national kind of religion, and then in England, separate from Catholic Church, they have set up an Anglican church. What the problem is with the state church, the political power and then religious power, it kind of they go together, hand in hand, meaning it's a easier, I mean, very easy recipe for corruption of a church. When the church becomes a national church, or the nation, there is something called nation's religion. So with the Reformation spirit still on, there were people within the church who were against the idea of having a state church, because what the state church did is they tried to control where to worship, how to worship, what to worship, the doctrine, theology, and so on. And always when there's a religion, not only the Christianity, any kind of religion in the world, whether it's Buddhism or Islamic faith, doesn't matter. They would have somewhat different variation. It is basically human nature, us being very creative. You would think of something else other than that you are taught to believe. Yeah, variation. This word you hear a lot these days. Delta variation, COVID-19. So coronavirus, even the virus, they do develop this variation, and as human beings, a lot complex than those viruses. So there are people who are developing these ideas. Why? And begin to ask a question. Why do we to worship the way they tell us to worship? So the issue is the freedom of worship. There are some people who wanted to worship in the way they want to, and in a place they want to. They don't wanted to come to the building, the church building. I mean, most these national churches obligated people to come to church. See, if you're born as a German, it automatically means that you are Lutheran, something like that. If you're born as an English, then you are either Catholic or Anglican. So that there's no other choice. And even though you have never confessed or made that decision to believe, believe basically it's a personal thing. Even though there's some cultural side to it or communal side, but basically it's personal. But they were told what to believe, where to worship, and how to worship, and so on. And then pietism is a kind of movement against that kind of religious style. So it's a variation of it not only becomes an issue of a style or how to worship or where to worship, it becomes a matter of theology and doctrine. They would focus on more like pietic, meaning devotional, devoted. And they believe there's a certain way of you being pietic or holy. So they thought this would be the certain way of being holy, so they focused on that style, and they kind of distance themselves from the Lutheran Church and the Baptist. This issue that had developed in the Europe at the 16th, 17th century, it becomes constant issue in the development of American church as well. Infant baptism. Both Catholics and Lutherans, Anglican churches, they practiced infant baptism. What it means is, as you are born, as a Lutheran or Anglican or whatever the national church is, even the Catholics, within a year period, usually after 7 days, sometimes very infant, a really little tiny baby, they were given the baptism by dripping water on forehead of a baby. Usually that's the mode. The reason they did is two. One is the polity. The church polity or church rule. Church rule says you are to baptize your baby as they are born into this national church. So I told you that as a citizen, you automatically becomes either Lutheran, Anglican, or whatever, even the Catholic. So that Catholic tradition of being born into a church as well as a citizen, it kind of continued even with the Reformation. So the Reformation, basically, it was against the theology doctrine, and then there's another thing. Church polity. Church polity is different from the general politic. Church polity is how you organize and order, arrange the system of order. So Catholic Church and then Protestant Church had a different polity, but still this polity is very vertical and authoritarian, meaning very top to bottom kind of system. So the philosophy about how you organize a church in a system, the pyramid, top to bottom, power structure, has not been changed. Today we see a lot of this horizontal kind of structure, polity in a church, especially in American churches. Yes, we do have more of horizontal, not the hierarchic system. See, vertical hierarchy, authoritarian, all has to do with this, power. There's someone who has the most power, and then there are people under that person. So infant baptism has to do with this church polity saying you automatically and you ought to, you must baptize your baby into this particular church when he or she is born within certain days. Another reason for the infant baptism is this. As you know, the Europe in the these before this, 16th, 17th, 15th century, there was this black flag, black plague, meaning the past, pandemic of past, just like we have pandemic of coronavirus today. But this is nothing compared to what they experienced in Europe by the past. This is a disease that is transferred by the rats, and then those bugs live with the rats. When they bite the rats, and then they bite the human being, and then pass the virus transfers and get into a person, and it's highly deadly, very deadly disease. So it killed a lot of people in Europe, millions and millions within certain period of time. So this pandemic was going on, and also there's a other kind of pandemic that goes on by season or by the trend. So that means the infant death rate is very high. Just few out of 10 would survive in their early infant age. So it is most likely that your baby may die without reaching 1 year old age. It's the same thing over not only in Europe but many Asian countries in the old days, pretty much the same. So infant death rate was very high. Having that, the question the parents would have as a believer, if you're a Christian, you're going to question whether my baby, when he or she dies that early, even without being able to speak or walk, that happens around 10-12 month period. They just begin to say mommy, daddy, and they take their first walk. So even before that, baby dies because of this all the sickness, the pandemic going on. And the question is, what happens to my baby? Are they going to go to heaven or not? And unfortunately, the Bible is not so clear about what happens. There's no certain doctrine stating what happens to the baby when he or she dies before they are able to acknowledge and have knowledge and have very basic personal cognitive ability to process the so-called Christianity, faith or belief or gospel, whatever you call it. So the question is, what happened to my baby? Are they going to enter, go to heaven or not? That's a big question big concern for any parents who are believers. So the church invented a kind of plea or ritual, so-called infant baptism. Because as you read the Bible, there's nowhere else in the Bible that talks or even does about the infant baptism. Of course, there is a infant circumcision in the Jewish tradition. On 8th day, as a baby was born, male baby, and 8th day they cut off the foreskin and then make it circumcision. But that's not baptism. Pretty similar to baptism, but that's no infant baptism like they did in the churches, in European churches in 16th, 17th century and on. So, some people begin to practice giving another baptism or the second baptism as they become an adult, and they are able to make their own personal decision about faith, about being a member of a church again. So this so-called second baptism is because everyone else who are born into the German or England or France or most of the Europe, for the matter of fact, even though they are not Protestant, if they are born as Catholic, they would have received so-called infant baptism, which kind of guarantees them to be a Christian. But those who believed, the belief has to be genuine. Genuine faith or genuine belief. True belief. What is a true belief? So here's a discussion about, which is true and which is not. Which is true and which is not. So these Anabaptists and Pietists are arguing the infant baptism is just a formal way. It is formal, but it's not valid. The validity of faith is granted, or it is proven when that person makes his or her own decision, genuine decision to believe in God or believe in that particular system of religion, whether it's Lutheran or Anglican, whatever, Catholic. So they thought, they believed, not only thought, they believed and established a doctrine saying you need a second baptism. You must have a second baptism when you're old enough to acknowledge yourself with your own free will to make that decision. So with that, another controversy about belief, Christian faith and belief arises. It's about free will to decide on your own. The problem with the Anabaptist and Pietism, it is against Calvinism. I'll further discuss this later on, again, when we come to the discussion of Calvinism. But here we need to, kind of see why this Calvinism becomes an issue. Calvinism says human beings are totally deprived. Deprived means that we are rotten. All rotten. We are nothing. Not only nothing, we are so rotten and broken that we are not able to do anything at all to make that kind of decision to come to know God. It is God who, with that mercy and His plan, definite plan, God has planned. He chose one to come to Him. He predestined means He already planned way before and selected those who come to this faith or belief in God. So according to this predestination Calvinistic idea, people are so wrong. They are not able to know or acknowledge or come to God by their own. We are not able to. Impossible for us to come to know God. Thus, knowing that, very natural, the rational explanation of us being a believer is, it is God who acted on His own to come to us and choose the one to come and believe. And He did everything. God has done everything, so we have nothing to say. Does the Bible say that? Yes, of course, the Bible says that. We are not able to come to know God. Calvin does not say this out of nowhere. His theology and the doctrine of predestination and the depravity, total depravity, is based on the Bible. But on the other hand, God has given us the second chance, and we still have this free will to choose what to believe, who to believe, and how to believe, and so on. So this idea of free will also has to do with that second baptism. Without acknowledging this free will, there's no need or no justification for second baptism. So this thing, do we have free will? Do we not? So that debate becomes conflict. So the conflict becomes division or schism. So, all the divisions that happens, not all, in this major division that happens within American church history and even the European church history, it has to do with this idea of, do we have that free will, or God is totally in control and we are just a mere subject. So this that depends on how you picture your God and how you picture a human being. So this is a worldview clash between these two different views, how you view man and God. And there are two different or four different ideas about how you're gonna see human being and God. So as people argue and debate, what matter is the authority of Bible. Of course, both group, whether you're free will side or predestined side or infant baptism only side or second baptism side, they all started their idea and argument. Their argument is based on Bible. So why there is a difference if they are all based on the Bible? The problem is interpretation. So the interpretation of Bible becomes the key to any understanding of theology, doctrine, church polity style, or church history. So I can safely conclude, doing church history, you're looking at how people interpreted the scripture, Bible. So most of church history, when it comes to doctrinal theological issues, has to do with the interpretation. And another side of very key element in understanding church history and even in history general is the human how human ego and greed, the personal individual greed and personal individual greed, took place in the course of history. Even within the church history, not just political, general, secular history, but in a church history itself, this human ego and human greed, your own private agenda as a person, it takes a very critical part in making of a history. So when we look at the history, the making of a history, there are two elements in church history. One is, again, probably the half of the things that happen in church history has to do with the individual and personal ego and greed. Personal agenda. And then on the other hand, as a church as a whole, it has to do with how you interpret the Bible. So when these combine together, some interpret the Bible with their own personal ego, greed, and plus when you begin to interpret the Bible with your own ego or your own greed, or according to your own philosophy and pre-embedded perception, or your own worldview that has not changed, then we have an issue. So many of the incidents, like infant baptism or second baptism or free will or predestination, these kind of debates, it could be purely theological and doctrinal. But sometimes, actually many times, it has to do more than purely purely doctrinal or theological or academic. There's something behind it. And us as a historian, a church historian, you should be able to see how personal agenda, personal interest, and personal inclination or favor has to do with the given event and the record of history. That's our job, to discern and determine what happened actually, what's behind it. So our job as a historian is to be able to identify those and try to see them, because the same thing is still happening among the church history. I mean, within the church, we still see those. And these debate, the free will versus predestination, or the infant baptism versus second baptism, is still going on. It's not resolved. Okay. So let's take a short break and I'll come back. Thank you. Okay, we are back and let's continue. So, Anabaptist, Pietist, and then later other development in American church history: Quakers, Mennonites, and Baptists. These are they were not in Europe. These are the denomination, or the people of believers who identified themselves as either Quakers, Mennonite, Methodist, Baptist. They were born. I mean, they're the indigenous denomination that arose within the American soil. But their root comes to this Anabaptist from Europe. The reason these Anabaptists again believed they should have a second baptism is because as a baby you don't have any sort of acknowledgement or understanding of God. So your decision, I mean, parents may give that as a ritual, or the infant baptism as a ritual, but they did not believe it is genuine. It is not valid. And you cannot saved by your parents' decision. So the issue becomes not only the matter of free will and the destination, the whole thing comes to this, the idea about because whether you like it or not, any religion that is called as religion, proper religion, they deal with this issue of salvation, because the major role, one of the major the role or the work of religion is to resolve the issue of death, because any human being born into this world have to deal with this issue of death. And unless it is resolved, you are going to ask yourself with a constant question, why do I have to die? What is the death? And what happened after the death? Because no one has come back to tell us actually what happens eternally. Is there life beyond this one or not? So these are the questions that any culture, any human being would have. And the job of religion is to answer that very ultimate question with the topic of salvation. So good religion, any good religion, will deal with this question about death and the salvation. How are we going to be saved from this miserable, rotten, and sickening world that we live in? How are we going to deal with this evil which is inside me and evil within the society and the culture? How are we going to deal with it? And where does evil come from? So these are the questions regarding the salvation. And as they discuss this issue of infant baptism against the second baptism, the issue is the salvation. Are these infants who has been or had been baptized with the consent of the parents who are believers usually, are they going to be saved because of that baptism? And the question is the baptism going to be able to be a mechanism or a routine or the ritual for salvation? That is again the question. Because Catholic faith, they believed, not all of them though, but basically they believed with the baptism they become a believer. And because of they become believer, they are saved. It's kind of wrong. I mean, different from what we believe today as a Protestant Christian or evangelical Christian. Because we believe, we are saved. And because we believe, then we express that belief with the ritual called baptism. That's how it is done. Not the baptism going to give you the salvation, but because you believe, you are going to be saved. And the baptism is only a ritual that kind of publicizes and that shows. And it is a kind of sign or symbol making it public. So today, even though you have not had that formal baptism, that has nothing to do with the salvation actually. But in that day, the baptism is a must for salvation. So when that is underlined, is the infant baptism enough to give salvation to that baby? And then Anna Baptist said, we do not know. We don't believe so. We are not certain. One of those. So not being certain, they wanted to have a ritual that make it certain of salvation. So they developed the idea of second baptism. You as an adult going to get a second baptism so you can be saved. The salvation is the key to any religion. You're coming to church to be saved. So in the city of Zurich, in January 21st, 1525, the first adult baptism was performed and given. And then the history of Anabaptism began. And another background that we need to be aware of as we try to understand American church history is Enlightenment that happened in the Europe. Enlightenment has two implications basically. One, the secular intention of enlightenment or implication from the secular development enlightenment or enlightenment in the secular domain is this. The age of reason says us human beings are reasonable. We have so-called brain. And we don't want to believe something that is not reasonable, that does not make sense. This is very critical for the religion, any religion, especially at the time. Either it's Catholic or Protestant, there are many things, the doctrine and theology, that is not reasonable. The thing is, first, reason cannot explain everything in this reality. The human reality is so complex and mysterious. The reason cannot explain, or you cannot understand intellectually everything. So that's a limitation of this enlightenment. But still, many who follow this philosophy of enlightenment says the religion is not reasonable. Therefore, I am going to give away or do away with religion. I'm going to throw that into trash can, sort of. So enlightenment becomes the movement against Christian religion in Europe, 17th, 18th century. It's a big thing. Now people are enlightened, meaning they are able to see, and many see themselves being manipulated by the church. And church have said many lies, not even in the Bible. Some of the things, for example, just baptism. Baptism does not guarantee you any salvation, but they sell the idea of baptism. And they try to continue, there are many lies. I cannot list all of them. But at the time of, it's still going on though. It hasn't changed much. There's still many lies, very devious things, untrue things, non-biblical things that are taught, and irrational, many irrational things, not mysterious. Trinity, for example, it's a very mystery. You will never be able to understand the full, this dynamic of Trinity, God in three and three God in one. That's mathematically impossible. That's philosophically not possible. Scientifically, of course, it's not possible. You cannot understand Trinity with a reason. So therefore, that's beyond our reason. God himself coming into the world, limited time and space, and living 30-some years and being killed by his own creation, that's impossible to understand with a reason. So there are some of the things that you cannot understand with a reason, but there are something that's obviously irrational, and the lies, and these are taught in the church. And these enlightenment, those who are enlightened, says, okay, because of these things, the religion is false. Religion is opium, someone said. And Nietzsche, the philosopher, said, God is dead. God is dead. He claimed that. So, as a result of enlightenment, the religion, the Christian religion, goes through this very anti-religious, anti-Christian period. On the other hand, because of the enlightenment, some of the believers in the church and church leaders now see that there is some that is not rational to the Bible. And the reason is a very key element in understanding Christianity. Doctrine, theology, and all these academic efforts, the scientific understanding of Scripture, these reasons come into the religion of Christianity. So Christianity was becoming more institutionalized, more mysterious kind of religion. Now, because of the Enlightenment, it balances. The faith and science kind of try to come together. And the reason and faith, which they thought was against one another, now it tried to interact. The faith and reason kind of comes together to be able to see more fully, better balanced doctrine and theology. So that's what had happened as America tried to develop its church. So all this background that I'm trying to focus on is it's behind all the events that are happened in American church history. So it is key to understand very basic ideas, the conflict and the struggles that had gone on, the issues, the interpretation of Bible, free will versus predestination, and then the idea about the salvation, and then the reason and the faith. These are the key issues in understanding American church history. So it's not so much remember what happened in what year and who are the characters, but behind it, why these characters and events had happened, and then what was the implication. So that's how we are going to view the history. So again, the continuing issue of the state church. I told you that in the Europe, especially the Europe, German and England, and then Italy still, the Catholic is the big the big power in Italy, Spain, and then Portugal. These are so-called Latin Europe. And in those countries, the Catholic is still dominant. But northern part of those Europe, the France, German, and Switzerland, Netherlands, and England, of course, and then Denmark. These are the countries who led this Reformation movement. And to the east of Germany and France, there's a Eastern Orthodox Church. So this Eastern Orthodox Church still has that traditional Catholic theology, pretty similar to the theology of Latin Catholic Church or the Roman Catholic Church for today. So these development in the Europe, the state church, having the state church, the Protestant church. Now that once they come apart from the Roman Catholic Church, and as we know, this the Reformation is not just a purely religious, but it has the political dimension to it. They wanted to separate themselves from this Roman Catholic Church, who the Pope has the power and authority of all the political issues and agenda in these countries, including France and Germany and England. Now, once they separate themselves from the Catholic Church, they have political independence and the freedom as the Reformation goes on. So the Reformation and this political separation from the Pope goes in hand. You should need to understand that to understand the state church. Once they become separate from the Catholic Church, they still have that idea the church and the state should be the same. So they have state church. So a state religion created by a state for use exclusively by that state. So that's what the state church is, how it is defined. So the political power and the church power usually goes in hand in hand, either same or goes in hand in hand. In a technical language, we call that a theocratic state or theocratic, meaning God and the politic is one. The religion and politic is one. That's theocratic. Now, what happens is as those Pietists, Anabaptists, and some other this minor religious movement happens in these countries where the state church is, this minor movement becomes illegal. And the so-called witch trials that had gone in these times also has to do with the religious freedom. And then some were even killed for translating Bible to their own language. Did you know that? Yeah, it did happen. So the state church, it becomes antagonist or the enemies against the true Christianity. That's what had happened, sadly. It did happen. So these minor groups of believers, either they are going to be killed for believing what they think is the genuine belief, or another choice is to become a refugee, flee to another country or elsewhere to exercise their freedom of worship. So that second element is a key to the nation of America today. That has to be. I mean, that's how it began. As you will read the history here in America, it's a Mayflower and so-called Puritans who came to American soil to settle down. The reason for them to move from Europe to America, first, it's a freedom to worship. They did take that risk. I mean, some of them had died. I mean, actually died in the process of coming to America in that ship. But they took that risk because they wanted to have that freedom of worship. So it is sometimes food, sometimes shelter, sometimes money that people die for, but more people died for the price of freedom. Freedom. See, freedom is something that is not tangible. You cannot touch it. You cannot buy it. You cannot sell it. And it's not visible. But that is so valuable. So valuable. People give their lives for the freedom. And unfortunately, still many countries over the world, on this earth, is not willing to give that full freedom to its people. Of course, there are reasons for these political leaders. They can defend themselves, giving all these reasons. And the main idea, they say, we are doing it for the people. And they're limiting the freedom of their people. See, as not only irony, as contradiction. But still, many people believe that, and trust their government, and even support that government. But you have to think, there's this very, you have to balance somewhere. Of course, you cannot have both in the full spectrum. But is your country, this government, your government, are they really true and genuine in promoting the freedom of each individual people in your nation, in our nation? So the same question goes to America. The government of America, are they really exercising the policy and the effort to promote, enhance, increase the freedom of its people while trying to protect their people? See, to govern and protect the people, there has to be certain regulations, of course. But it should not go against very basic fundamental freedom of choice, freedom to choose, right? Freedom to speak, and freedom to live where you want to live, and freedom of choosing the occupation, and so on. So there are this very fundamental freedom that we need to guard. And where these ideas come from? Of course, it's Bible. The Bible, I told you that this whole idea of democracy, so-called democracy, is not from the Greek political system. No, that has nothing to do with the democracy that we know today. Some people, some scholars argue that it came from ancient Greek system of politics, and we are just trying to follow that. No, that's not true. The whole idea of the freedom of each individual and the right of human being, the dignity of human being, it all comes out of the biblical ideal, biblical worldview and philosophy. So these refugees are trusting Bible to be their text, their guideline, and their foundation for their faith, rather than government or the priest or the pastors who are teaching. The political leaders, they don't care about actually individual personal biblical teachings, but they use, most of political leaders use this faith, the Christianity, for their advantage. Again, their ego, their greed, and their agenda, their philosophy, their ideology is interpreting Bible. That's not how it happens. That's how it should happen. The Bible should interpret you instead of you interpreting the Bible. This is a very fundamental, the bottom line about our Christian faith. Again, I say, Bible should interpret you and your society, your culture, your politics, whatever the reality is given. Not you or your culture, your social agenda interpreting Bible. Unfortunately, even within the church, the pastors and the teachers, they try to interpret the Bible from their perspective, from their agenda, from their needs. And that's wrong. That's totally wrong. And today it is very difficult for us pastors to teach and try to interpret your church members, your disciples with the Bible. When we try to do that, there's a very great opposition from these people in the church who are so soft and so manipulated or brainwashed by these worldly secular philosophy and ideology and the thoughts and values and worldviews and cultures. There's strong resistance from your congregation. And still, our job as pastor is to preach what the Bible, how Bible interprets you. See, it's not easy today. And you may lose your job as a pastor because many congregation members today say they are employing the pastor. We are not employees. The pastor is not. We are not employees. Or see, and they think they are employer. No, that's not how it is. But as you read the American church history, that trend kind of becomes normal. Anyway, going back to the refugee. So they decide to go another country. So we see many refugees today. Political, because of the war, because of famine, and natural disaster. This all causes them to be refugees. But at the time, this religious refugee, because of their faith, they could not live in the country of their own anymore. It is sad, but that happened. And again, the separatists. Separatists are the general name for those who are trying to separate themselves from the Catholic Church, or especially the Protestant Church that we know of. And these are mainly English Protestants who occupied the extreme wing of Puritanism. In this sense, the separatists are the separatists of all the separatists. They are the extreme ones. They try to separate themselves from even this Calvinistic faith. Who's promoting Calvinistic Protestant, the Presbyterian or Protestants, Calvinistic Protestants, they are focusing on predestination, and they also abolished or banned the second baptism. They say second baptism is not right, you cannot do that, and that's against the church and so on. So they banned it, they prohibited it. So Separate says, no, we don't, we want to do this. And they try to separate themselves and make a sect. And when you create a sect, a separate group, there is a danger of you being labeled as a cult. A cult. So that does happen in the history. So some of the cults were actually the genuine true believers in the history. But that doesn't mean today's cult are the same. You know, it is different. Anyway. Yeah, I think the time's up for today and the 7th week. And I'll come back and see you and for the week number 8. So thank you for listening and take care and see you next week. Bye bye.